A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was looking at a shelf in a bookstore the other day, and it felt like half of the self-help section was just different shades of the same ancient philosophy. It is everywhere right now. From Silicon Valley boardrooms to professional sports locker rooms, people are obsessed with Stoicism. It has become this ultimate productivity hack for the modern age. Our housemate, Daniel, actually sent us a prompt about this very thing earlier today. He was asking about the origins of Stoicism, and whether it is actually as boring and emotionless as people make it out to be. It is a fair question, especially when you see it being marketed as a way to just become a more efficient machine.
It is funny you say that, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. You are right, there is a massive trend right now that some people have started calling bro-icism. It is this specific flavor of Stoicism that has been stripped down into a sort of grit your teeth and endure it manual for tech executives and athletes. It is often used to justify working 18-hour days or ignoring the human cost of a business decision. But if you actually dig into the original texts, the stuff from 300 before Christ in Athens, it is a lot more sophisticated than just being a tough guy who does not cry. It is a rigorous cognitive framework. It is almost like a mental operating system designed to handle a volatile world. And in March of 2026, with the pace of change we are seeing, a stable operating system is exactly what people are desperate for.
That is a great way to frame it. An operating system. Because if you look at the world today, it feels incredibly volatile. We are dealing with massive algorithmic shifts, geopolitical tension that seems to change by the hour, and a constant fire hose of information that our brains were never designed to process. I can see why people would go looking for a firewall. But I want to push on Daniel's point. Is it just a coping mechanism for burnout? Or is there something deeper in the actual logic of it? His question about it being boring is interesting too. If the goal is to be totally unperturbed, does that mean you just stop caring about everything? That sounds like a pretty great way to live your life. If nothing can touch you, does that mean nothing can move you either?
That is the #1 misconception, and we should probably tackle that right out of the gate. People hear the word stoic and they think of a stone wall. They think of someone who has no feelings, no passion, and no joy. But the ancient Stoics actually made a very clear distinction between what they called the passions, which were irrational, misplaced emotions like anger, envy, and debilitating fear, and the eupatheia, which were the good feelings. They were not trying to become robots. They were trying to clear away the mental clutter that prevents you from experiencing genuine joy, gratitude, and tranquility. The Greek word they used was apatheia, which sounds like apathy in English, but it means something totally different. In the original context, it meant freedom from suffering, and freedom from being jerked around by things you cannot control. It is not about not caring, it is about caring about the right things.
So it is less about being empty and more about being stable. Like a ship that does not capsize just because the waves are high. I like that. But let us get into the technical side of this operating system you mentioned. Every system has a core constraint, right? In Stoicism, it seems like that constraint is the dichotomy of control. Can you break down how that actually functions as a technical principle? Because it sounds simple on the surface, but I imagine the implementation is where it gets tricky. How do you actually draw that line when your life is intertwined with so many external factors?
The dichotomy of control is the foundational algorithm of Stoicism. It was most famously articulated by Epictetus, who was born a slave before he became a prominent teacher. He basically said that some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. Up to us are our own opinions, our intentions, our desires, and our own actions. Not up to us is everything else. That includes your reputation, your wealth, the weather, the outcome of a project, and even your own physical body to some extent. The Stoic argument is that all human misery comes from a category error. We try to exert control over things that are fundamentally external, and we neglect the one thing we actually do control, which is our own faculty of judgment. It is the ultimate internal locus of control.
Okay, but let's push on that a bit. If I'm a software engineer and I'm working on a major launch, the outcome of that launch is technically external, right? I do not control if the servers crash, or if the market hates the product, or if a competitor drops a better version an hour before I do. But if I just say, well, the outcome is not up to me, does that not lead to a lack of excellence? Does that not give me an excuse to be mediocre because the result doesn't matter? This is where the boring or passive critique usually comes from. It sounds like a recipe for checked out employees.
That is a classic challenge to the philosophy, and the Stoics had a very specific answer for it. They used the analogy of the archer to explain this. An archer can choose his bow, he can maintain his arrows, he can practice his form for years, and he can choose the exact moment to release the string. All of those things are within his control. But the moment the arrow leaves the bow, it is no longer up to him. A gust of wind could blow it off course, or the target could move, or a bird could fly in the way. A Stoic archer finds his satisfaction in the excellence of the shot, not necessarily in hitting the bullseye. He wants to hit the bullseye, obviously, but his internal peace is not tied to it. It is about internalizing the goal. You shift from "I must win" to "I will do everything in my power to play the best game possible." It is a subtle shift, but it creates a psychological firewall. You are no longer a hostage to fortune. You are focused on the process, which, ironically, usually leads to better results anyway.
It is interesting because that reminds me of some of the themes we touched on back in episode 971, when we were talking about stress testing the soul in the age of artificial intelligence. We discussed that feeling of philosophical exhaustion, where it feels like we have lost our agency to the algorithms. Stoicism seems to offer a way to reclaim that agency by shrinking the battlefield to just the space between your ears. It is a very high locus of control worldview, even if it acknowledges external limitations. But I want to go back to the origins for a second. We talk about Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus a lot, but this started way before them in Athens. How did it evolve from a bunch of guys talking on a porch to becoming the unofficial religion of the Roman Empire? What was the bridge there?
It is a fascinating trajectory. It was founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 before Christ. He was a shipwrecked merchant who ended up in Athens and started studying under the Cynics. He eventually started teaching his own philosophy at the Stoa Poikile, which just means the painted porch. That is where the name Stoicism comes from. In the beginning, it was very much a complete system of logic, physics, and ethics. They believed in the logos, which is this idea that the universe has a rational, deterministic structure. To the early Stoics, living a good life meant living in accordance with nature, or living in accordance with reason. They saw the universe as a single living organism governed by rational principles.
When you say logos and deterministic structure, that sounds very much like modern systems thinking. If you believe the universe is a rational system, then your job is to understand the variables and align yourself with them. It is almost like a precursor to the scientific method, or at least a very structured way of looking at cause and effect. It is about debugging your relationship with reality.
The Stoics were big on the idea that nothing happens by accident. Everything is part of a web of cause and effect. But as the philosophy moved from Greece to Rome, it became much more pragmatic. The Romans were not as interested in the abstract logic of the universe. They wanted to know how to lead armies, manage an empire, and survive the whims of crazy emperors without losing their minds. That is where we get the big names we know today. Seneca, who was a wealthy advisor to Nero, Epictetus, the former slave, and of course, Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. It is incredible when you think about it. You have a slave and an emperor following the exact same cognitive manual. It shows that the philosophy is scale invariant. It works regardless of your social standing or your power level because it focuses entirely on the internal state.
I think that is why it resonates so much in our current era. Whether you are a college student or a high-powered executive, the feeling of being overwhelmed is the same. But let's look at one of the more intense practices they advocate for, the premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils. This is basically negative visualization. In a world that is obsessed with positive thinking and manifesting your best life, the Stoics tell you to spend time every morning imagining everything that could go wrong. Your house burning down, losing your job, your friends betraying you. Herman, How is that not just a recipe for anxiety? If I start my day thinking about my house burning down, I am probably going to have a pretty terrible day.
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But it is actually a very effective form of risk modeling and emotional inoculation. The idea is that the thing that hurts us the most is the unexpectedness of a blow. If you have already walked through the scenario of a server migration failing or a deal falling through, you have already processed the initial shock. You have built a contingency plan in your mind. It takes the power away from the event. It is like exposure therapy. By looking the worst case scenario in the eye, you realize that you could probably still find a way to be a decent person and function even if it happened. It removes the paralyzing fear of the unknown. It is not about dwelling on the negative, it is about preparing for it so that when it happens you can say, I have already considered this, and here's how we move forward.
It is like a pre-mortem in project management. You assume the project has failed, and then you look for the causes. By doing that personally, you are essentially debugging your own life before the errors even occur. I can see how that would make you much more resilient, but I do worry about the second-order effects of this. If you are always visualizing the worst and telling yourself that external things don't matter, do you risk becoming indifferent to the suffering of others? If a Stoic sees an injustice, does he just say, well, that is an external thing I do not control, so I will just stay calm and do nothing? This is the core of the bro-icism critique, right? That it is a philosophy of the privileged who can afford to be indifferent.
That is a vital point, Korn, and it is one of the areas where modern bro-icism often fails. The ancient Stoics were not isolationists. They believed in the concept of cosmopolitanism, the idea that we are all citizens of the world. They believed we have a duty to our community, our family, and our country. Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign fighting wars on the frontier and managing a plague that was devastating Rome. He did not just sit in a room and meditate on how nothing matters. The Stoic view is that while the outcome of your social action is not entirely up to you, the duty to act is. You act because it is the rational and virtuous thing to do, not because you are guaranteed a specific result. They have this concept of preferred indifference. Health is better than sickness. Wealth is better than poverty. Justice is better than injustice. You should prefer those things and work toward them with everything you have, but you should not let your fundamental happiness depend on them.
So it is a philosophy of action, but with a detached relationship to the results. That is a very difficult balance to strike. I think about how this applies to our world today, specifically in the context of high-stakes environments. If you are a leader in a crisis, you are dealing with massive high-stakes variables every day. You have to be deeply committed to the survival and prosperity of your people. But if you let every setback destroy your internal peace, you are going to make terrible decisions based on panic or anger. Stoicism seems like it would be a mandatory requirement for leadership in high-pressure environments, like emergency medicine or software incident response.
It really is. In software incident response, or SRE, the principles are almost identical. When a system goes down and you are losing thousands of dollars a second, the worst thing you can do is panic. You have to focus on what you can control, the logs, the code, the communication. You have to accept the fact that the system is down as a given and work from there. And you see this in the history of military leadership too. James Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for over 7 years, credited Epictetus with saving his life. He said that the people who didn't make it out were the optimists. The ones who kept saying, we'll be home by Christmas, and then Christmas would come and go, and they would die of a broken heart. Stockdale used Stoicism to stay grounded in the brutal reality of his situation while maintaining a clear focus on his own conduct and his loyalty to his fellow prisoners. He focused entirely on what was within his control in a situation where almost everything was taken away. That is the ultimate stress test of the philosophy.
That is a powerful example. It actually reminds me of what we discussed in episode 546 about the humility of the present. We talked about how our current medical and scientific understandings might look barbaric in 80 years. Stoicism has that same kind of humility built into it. It acknowledges that we have a very limited perspective on the universe. We are just one small part of a much larger system. By accepting that, you stop taking everything so personally. You stop thinking the universe has a grudge against you when things go wrong. You realize that you are just a variable in a much larger equation.
It is about zooming out. Marcus Aurelius used to talk about looking at things from above, seeing the vastness of time and space to realize how small our current problems are. Now, I want to pivot to the modern continuation of this. We have talked about the ancient roots, but how did we get to where we are now? One of the biggest bridges between ancient Stoicism and modern life is actually psychology, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Right, I have heard this before. Aaron Beck, the founder of CBT, explicitly mentioned that the intellectual foundations of his work were in Stoicism. It is basically the idea that our feelings are not caused by events themselves, but by our interpretations of those events. It is the judgment that creates the pain, not the fact.
Precisely. If you lose your job, the event is just a fact. One person might interpret that as, I am a failure, I will never work again, which leads to depression. Another person might interpret it as, this is a chance to find a better fit, or even just, this is a challenge I need to navigate. The event is the same, but the internal judgment creates a totally different emotional reality. CBT is essentially a clinical application of Stoic logic. It teaches you to identify irrational thoughts, challenge them with evidence, and replace them with more rational ones. It is wild that a 300-year before Christ philosophy is the backbone of the most effective form of modern therapy we have in 2026.
It speaks to the durability of the insights. Human nature hasn't changed that much in 2,000 years. We still have the same hardware. We are just running different software. But what about the popularizers today? People like Ryan Holiday have made a massive business out of Stoicism. He wrote, "The obstacle is the way, and stillness is the key." Then you have someone like Massimo Pigliucci, who is a philosopher and a scientist, who writes about it from a more academic, but still practical perspective. What do you think about this move into the mainstream? Is it diluting the philosophy, or is it just making it useful for a new generation?
It is a double-edged sword. On one hand, Ryan Holiday has done an incredible job of making these ideas accessible to people who would never pick up a dusty copy of Seneca's letters. He frames it in a way that is very actionable. He uses examples from history and business to show how these principles work in practice. That is a net positive. But the risk, as we mentioned earlier, is the Stoic washing. When it gets turned into just another productivity tool to help you work 16-hour days for a corporation without complaining, it loses its ethical heart. Stoicism was never just about being more efficient, it was about being more virtuous. It was about character. If you strip away the ethics and the duty to the common good, you are just left with a very effective form of emotional suppression that serves the interests of whoever is in power.
That is the danger of any ancient wisdom in a capitalist context. It gets optimized for the bottom line. I have noticed this even in software development, with things like site reliability engineering. There is a lot of stoicism in how SRE teams handle incidents. When a system goes down, you don't want people panicking or blaming each other. You want them to focus on what they can control, follow the protocol, and stay calm. That is great for the system, but you have to make sure you are not using that culture to ignore the fact that the team is being overworked, or that the underlying architecture is fundamentally broken. You can't use stoicism as a band-aid for systemic failure. You can't tell people to be stoic about a toxic work environment.
That is a brilliant point. Stoicism is a tool for the individual to handle the world, but it shouldn't be a tool for the world to exploit the individual. We have to keep that distinction clear. Another interesting modern thinker is William Irvine. He wrote A Guide to the Good Life, and he introduced some interesting modern tweaks, like the dichotomy of control. He argues that there is a third category, things we have some but not total control over, like winning a tennis match. You control your practice and your effort, but not the final result. It is a way of making the philosophy even more applicable to the nuances of modern life where things are rarely black and white.
I like that. It feels more honest to how we actually experience the world. So, if we are looking at the practical side of this for our listeners, how do you actually start practicing this without it becoming a full-time job? Because I know the Stoics were big on daily rituals. They didn't just read the books, they did the work. They treated philosophy as a practice, not just a subject of study.
The most effective place to start is with a morning and evening review. In the morning, you look ahead at your day. You identify the challenges you might face and you remind yourself of the dichotomy of control. You might say to yourself, today I am going to meet with people who are meddlesome, ungrateful, and arrogant. That is actually a direct quote from Marcus Aurelius. The point isn't to be cynical, it is to remove the element of surprise. If someone is rude to you, you have already planned for it. You don't have to let it ruin your day because you already expected it as a possibility. It is about setting your internal expectations to match reality.
And the evening review? Is that like a performance audit? Do you just sit there and list all the times you failed to be a perfect stoic?
Seneca was big on this. Before you go to sleep, you ask yourself, what did I do well today? Where did I fall short? What could I do better tomorrow? It is not about beating yourself up or wallowing in guilt. It is about being a dispassionate observer of your own life. You are looking for patterns. You are looking for those moments where you lost your cool or where you let an external event dictate your internal state. It is like a daily retrospective in an agile workflow. You are just trying to iterate and improve the quality of your judgment over time. You are debugging your reactions.
I can see how that would lead to a much more intentional life. It is the opposite of boring. It is actually very intense because you are constantly monitoring your own mind. It is like being the administrator of your own consciousness. Another concept that I find really powerful, though a bit difficult to swallow, is amor fati, love of fate. It is not just accepting what happens, but actually loving it. That seems like a very high bar. If my hard drive fails and I lose a week of work, I am supposed to love that? That feels like a bridge too far for most people.
It sounds radical, doesn't it? But the logic is that since the event has already happened, it is now part of the deterministic fabric of the universe. To wish it hadn't happened is to fight against reality itself. That is a losing battle that only leads to suffering. Amor fati is about taking whatever happens and saying, okay, this is the raw material I have to work with now. How can I use this? If you lose a week of work, maybe the second version will be better because you have already solved the hardest problems. Maybe it is a chance to practice patience. It is about turning every obstacle into fuel. The fire doesn't complain about the wood you throw on it, it just gets hotter and brighter. It is about radical acceptance followed by radical action.
It is a total reframing of technical debt or failed deployments. Instead of seeing them as disasters, you see them as the necessary steps in the process. It reminds me of the history of the Jewish people in many ways. There has been so much historical faith thrown our way that was objectively terrible. Yet the culture is built on taking that fate and turning it into something resilient and meaningful. There is a deeply stoic thread in that kind of survival and persistence. It is about finding meaning in the struggle rather than just trying to avoid the struggle.
There really is. It is that refusal to be a victim of circumstance. It is the realization that while you cannot control what history does to you, you can control how you respond and what you build out of the ruins. That is where the real power lies. It is the ultimate form of agency.
So, for someone listening who wants to go deeper than just the modern summaries or the Instagram quotes, what should they actually read? Should they go straight to the source? Is there a specific order that makes sense for a modern reader?
I always recommend starting with the Enchiridion by Epictetus. It is very short, almost like a manual of bullet points. It was compiled by his student Orion, and it is designed to be a handbook you can carry with you. It is punchy and direct. From there, move to the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Just keep in mind that he never intended for it to be published. It was his private journal, so it is him talking to himself, often reminding himself of the basics because he was struggling with them just like we do. It is very repetitive because he was trying to drill these ideas into his own head. And if you want something more literary and expansive, Seneca's Letters from a Stoic are fantastic. He is a great writer and covers everything from grief to how to handle your wealth to how to deal with annoying neighbors.
It is interesting that the Emperor of Rome was struggling with the basics. It makes the whole thing feel much more human. We think of these people as statues, but they were just guys trying to figure out how to live in a chaotic world. Before we wrap up, I want to ask about the future. We are moving into a world where we are increasingly connected to machines. We are talking about human, AI alignment, and the role of algorithms in our lives. Does Stoicism have a place in that future? Do we need to build Stoic AA, or do we just need to be more stoic to survive the AI?
That is a deep question. I think we definitely need to be more stoic to navigate the world that AI is creating. As the feedback loops get faster and the information gets more overwhelming, the need for an internal anchor becomes even more critical. If we don't have a solid cognitive framework, we are just going to be swept away by the next outrage cycle or the next algorithmic trend. As for Stoic AA, that is a fascinating thought experiment. A machine that is purely rational, that has no irrational passions, and that focuses entirely on its core objective regardless of external noise. That sounds like the definition of a Stoic. But of course, we want that machine to have an ethical framework that values human life and virtue, which is the part of Stoicism we can't afford to lose. A Stoic AI without the concept of the common good would be a very dangerous thing.
It is a lot to think about. This has been a great exploration, Herman. I think we have definitely moved past the boring stereotype. It is a very active, demanding, and ultimately empowering way of looking at the world. It is about taking back the power that we so often give away to things that don't deserve it.
I agree. It is about taking full responsibility for the one thing you actually own, your mind. Everything else is just a loan from fate. And in a world where everything feels like it is on loan, that is a very powerful thing to hold on to.
Well, if you have been listening and you have found this discussion helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We have over 1,000 episodes in the archive now, covering everything from ancient history to the latest in tech, so there is plenty more to explore.
Yeah, and you can find all of those along with our RSS feed and a contact form at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify, so you can follow us there to get every new episode as it drops. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt today. It really gave us a lot to chew on. It is always good to go back to the foundations.
Definitely. This has been My Weird Prompts. We are the Poppleberry Brothers, and we will be back soon with another deep dive.
Until next time, focus on what you can control and let the rest go.
Thanks for listening. We will talk to you in the next one.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to